The armies that marched into Belgium and northern France in August 1914 expected movement, decision, and victory by Christmas. They received none of these things. Instead, they created a scar across Europe that would consume 4 years, millions of lives, and the assumption that civilization and progress were permanent states. The German advance through Belgium followed the Schlieffen Plan's requirements. Speed was essential. The French attacked into Alsace-Lorraine with equal confidence. Both sides possessed doctrine, training, and recent battlefield experience from colonial wars. Neither possessed accurate intelligence about what industrial firepower would do to mass infantry formations. By September, the casualties were already beyond comprehension. The Battle of the Frontiers killed or wounded over 300,000 French soldiers in less than 3 weeks. German losses approached 250,000. These were not the casualties of a campaign. They were the casualties of daily combat across a front stretching hundreds of miles. The Marne stopped the German advance. The race to the sea followed. Neither side won. Both sides dug. By November 1914, a continuous line of fieldworks extended from the English Channel to the Swiss border. 440 miles of trench, wire, and artillery positions. The Western Front had been born. Trenches were not a failure of imagination. They were a rational response to firepower. A man standing in the open within rifle range died. A man advancing across open ground toward machine gun positions died faster. Artillery made the equation worse. By late 1914, both sides understood that attacking without overwhelming artillery preparation was suicide. Attacking with overwhelming artillery preparation surrendered surprise. The trench system evolved rapidly. Front line, support line, reserve line, communication trenches connecting them, dugouts, latrines, aid stations, command posts, ammunition dumps. The front became a city built below ground level, housing hundreds of thousands of men in conditions that Victorian Britain would have considered criminal for convicts. Captain Charles Carrington of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment described the routine in his post-war memoir. He calculated that a typical British soldier spent roughly 70 days per year in the frontline trenches, another 30 in support trenches, 120 in reserve positions, and the remainder in rest areas, hospitals, or travel. The frontline rotation was not continuous exposure, it was repeated exposure, week after week, with no clear endpoint. The casualty rate during quiet periods averaged 300 men per day across the British sector alone. These were not battle casualties, they were the cost of existing near the enemy. Sniper fire, random shelling, trench raids, disease, accidents. A battalion entering the line at full strength could expect to lose 10% of its men to routine attrition before any major offensive began. The fighting around Ypres in late 1914 predated the mature trench system. It remained mobile longer than most sectors. This made it worse. The British Expeditionary Force, the professional army that had deployed to France in August, ceased to exist as a coherent force by the end of November. The Germans attacked repeatedly, attempting to break through to the Channel ports. British and French units, undermanned and exhausted, held positions with resources that would have been considered inadequate for training exercises. Battalions that began the battle with 1,000 men finished with 200. Some units were destroyed entirely. Lieutenant Ernst Junger, German Army, would later write about the fighting near Langemarck, where German reserve formations composed largely of students and recent volunteers attacked British positions. The German losses were catastrophic. Entire companies were cut down by rifle fire from professional soldiers who had trained for a decade. The Germans called it the Kindermord bei Ypres, the massacre of the innocents at Ypres. The British called it survival. Captain James Jack of the Scottish Rifles recorded in his diary that by mid-November his battalion had been reduced to 150 men. Officers were commanding platoons, sergeants were commanding companies. The chain of command existed on paper but had dissolved in practice. First, Ypres established patterns that would dominate the Western Front for the next 4 years. Attacking forces suffered disproportionate casualties. Defending forces suffered sufficient casualties to prevent exploitation. Ground changed hands across distances measured in hundreds of yards. The dead accumulated faster than they could be buried. The trench descriptions of trench life tend toward two extremes, either sanitized for civilian consumption or sensationalized for dramatic effect. The reality was neither. It was monotonous, degrading, and periodically lethal. Water was the primary enemy during winter months. The water table in Flanders sat close to the surface. Trenches required constant pumping and drainage work. When pumps failed or drainage systems collapsed, men stood in water that reached their knees or waist. Trench foot developed within hours under these conditions. The flesh rotted while still attached to the bone. Severe cases required amputation. Lieutenant Colonel Graham Seaton Hutchison of the Machine Gun Corps described a sector near Loos, where his unit occupied trenches that flooded during every heavy rain. The men stood on duckboards elevated above the trench floor. When shells destroyed the duckboards, soldiers occasionally drowned in the mud at the bottom of their own defensive positions. Lice were universal. Every man on the Western Front hosted lice regardless of rank, cleanliness, or unit. The parasites lived in the seams of uniforms and fed continuously. Soldiers developed techniques for killing them, burning the seams with candle flames, crushing them between thumbnails. None of these methods worked permanently. The lice returned within hours. Rats bred in the corpses that lay in no man's land and the bodies buried in trench walls. They grew fat on human remains. Soldiers reported rats the size of cats. This was not exaggeration. Lieutenant Robert Graves of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers recorded shooting a rat that weighed close to 2 pounds. The creatures were bold. They would approach sleeping men and gnaw at exposed skin. Disease killed as efficiently as bullets. Dysentery swept through units with regularity. Typhoid remained a threat despite vaccination programs. Influenza could disable entire battalions. Men weakened by malnutrition, stress, and exposure had no reserves to fight infection. The smell was permanent. Unwashed bodies, overflowing latrines, decomposing corpses, poison gas residue, cordite, mud that reeked of chemicals and decay. Men became nose-blind to their own sector, but could smell other units' trenches from hundreds of yards away. The Germans introduced chlorine gas on the Western Front on April 22, 1915. The attack targeted French colonial troops holding positions north of Ypres. The gas cloud drifted across no man's land in the late afternoon, driven by favourable winds. Chlorine is heavier than air. It sank into the trenches. Men breathing the gas experienced immediate respiratory distress. The chlorine reacted with moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid. Victims drowned in the fluid their own lungs produced. Those who survived the initial exposure often suffered permanent lung damage. The French colonial units broke. They had no protection and no training for chemical warfare. The gap in the Allied line extended for several miles. German infantry advanced behind the gas cloud and occupied abandoned positions. The British rushed Canadian units into the breach. The Canadians held, fighting without gas masks, using urine-soaked cloth held over their faces as improvised filters. Private William Hay of the Royal Scots later described what he witnessed. Men lying in trenches, gasping, skin turning blue, drowning in open air. The sound of hundreds of men choking simultaneously. The smell of the gas itself, similar to a strong mixture of bleach and pepper. Officers trying to rally men while breathing the same poison. The British response was characteristically methodical. Within weeks, primitive gas masks were being distributed. Within months, the Allies were producing their own chemical weapons. By 1918, gas had become routine. Artillery shells carried it, projectors launched it. Both sides maintained chemical warfare companies as standard elements of division structure. Gas killed approximately 90,000 men on all fronts during the war. It disabled over 1 million more. The psychological effect exceeded the casualties. Gas could not be seen approaching until it arrived. Gas did not discriminate between brave men and cowards. Gas turned the air itself into a weapon. Lieutenant Colonel Seaton Hutchison recorded that after gas became common, soldiers developed a constant low-level anxiety that had not existed before. Sentries watched for gas clouds as carefully as they watched for infantry attacks. The fear was rational. Gas killed men in dugouts thought to be safe. It lingered in low ground for hours after release. It contaminated equipment and made wounded men more likely to die from their injuries. The German attack on Verdun was not designed to break through. It was designed to bleed France to death. General Erich von Falkenhayn articulated this explicitly in his planning documents. He would select a target the French could not abandon for political and symbolic reasons, then feed German artillery shells into the sector until French reserves were consumed. Verdun was a fortress complex east of the Meuse River. It had symbolic significance dating to earlier wars. Falkenhayn calculated correctly. The French would defend Verdun regardless of cost. The bombardment began on February 21st, 1916. German artillery fired over 1 million shells in the first 12 hours. The barrage continued for days. The French frontline positions ceased to exist as coherent defensive structures. The landscape was reworked into overlapping shell craters filled with fragments of men and equipment. German infantry advanced against what remained. They captured Fort Douaumont on February 25th. The French rushed reinforcements forward. General Philippe Pétain assumed command and organized a supply route that would become known as La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way, a single road from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun. Every French unit that fought at Verdun traveled that road. Trucks passed every 14 seconds at peak periods, carrying men and ammunition forward, evacuating wounded on the return trip. The battle expanded across both banks of the Meuse. Neither side achieved breakthrough. Both sides committed more units. The Germans attacked, the French counterattacked. Positions changed hands repeatedly. A stretch of trench might belong to the Germans in the morning, and the French by evening. Both sides would lose hundreds of men in the exchange. Neither side gained strategic advantage. Captain Alfred Joubert of the French 124th Infantry Regiment wrote in his diary in May 1916. He described the bombardment as continuous, shells landing every few seconds, the ground shaking without pause, men going mad from the noise and concussion, officers losing the ability to give coherent orders because shouting could not overcome the sound of artillery. Joubert was killed by shellfire 3 weeks after making that entry. The battle lasted 10 months. French casualties approached 400,000. German casualties were comparable. The fortress complex remained in French hands. Tactically, the battle was a draw. Strategically, both armies were damaged beyond any benefit the fighting produced. Second Lieutenant Alfred Dugan-Chater of the British Artillery visited the Verdun sector in late 1916 as an observer. He recorded that the landscape no longer resembled Europe. Trees had been reduced to splinters. Villages had been erased. The ground was composed entirely of shell craters, some deep enough to hide a house. The smell of decay was so thick it could be tasted. Chater noted that French soldiers in the sector exhibited a level of fatigue and psychological strain he had not observed elsewhere on the front. Verdun accomplished Falkenhayn's objective only partially. France was bled heavily, but Germany bled alongside it. The battle exhausted both nations' willingness to conduct similar operations. It also demonstrated that the Western Front could absorb casualties that would have ended any previous war without producing decision. The British offensive on the Somme was intended to relieve pressure on Verdun and break the German defensive line. It accomplished neither objective. It killed or wounded over 1 million men across both sides. It advanced the British line by roughly 6 miles at its deepest penetration. The preliminary bombardment began on June 24, 1916. British artillery fired approximately 1.5 million shells over 7 days. The barrage was visible from southern England. The sound carried across the Channel. The assumption was that no defensive position could survive such firepower. The assumption was incorrect. German dugouts were constructed deep underground, reinforced with concrete and timber. Many survived. German machine gun crews waited in these dugouts during the bombardment, then returned to firing positions when the artillery lifted. British infantry advancing across no man's land on the morning of July 1st encountered machine gun fire from positions that were supposed to have been destroyed. The casualty figures for the first day of the Somme are well documented. 57,470 British casualties, including 19,240 dead. These were the casualties of a single day. Most occurred in the first hour. Some battalions lost 90% of their strength before reaching German wire. Private Reginald Glenn of the Queen's Westminster Rifles described advancing in waves across open ground, men walking upright in extended lines, maintaining parade ground formation because doctrine required it, German machine guns firing continuously into the formations, men falling so quickly that the ground appeared to be covered with bodies within minutes. Glenn survived by lying among the dead until darkness allowed him to crawl back to British lines. The battle continued for months. British commanders concluded that the initial attack had failed due to insufficient artillery preparation. Subsequent attacks employed more artillery. The results were comparable. German defences absorbed the bombardment, then inflicted severe casualties on attacking infantry. Tanks were introduced on September 15th. 49 Mark I tanks participated in the attack at Flers-Courcelette. The machines were mechanically unreliable. Most broke down before reaching German lines. Those that penetrated caused panic among German defenders, but lacked support to exploit success. The psychological impact exceeded the tactical effect. Lieutenant Stuart Dolden of the Tank Corps recorded that his tank covered approximately 200 yards before mechanical failure disabled it. The crew abandoned the vehicle under rifle fire and returned to British lines on foot. Dolden noted that infantry following the tanks advanced further than infantry without tank support, suggesting the machines had value despite their limitations. The Somme offensive ended in November when weather made further operations impractical. British and French forces had captured several fortified villages and advanced their line between 3 and 7 miles, depending on sector. The Germans had constructed new defensive positions behind the original line. The strategic situation was unchanged. Casualty estimates vary by source. British casualties approached 420,000. French casualties were approximately 200,000. German casualties ranged between 450,000 and 600,000. These figures represent killed, wounded, and missing. They do not include psychological casualties, though shell shock cases increased dramatically during the offensive. Private Harry Patch of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry fought at the Somme and survived the war. Decades later, he described the battle as calculated slaughter. Men ordered to advance into machine gun fire because commanders lacked alternatives. Officers dying alongside their men because courage was not the issue. The mathematics of firepower versus flesh, producing predictable results that senior leadership refused to acknowledge. Artillery dominated the Western Front. Infantry took ground. Artillery decided whether they could hold it. By 1916, artillery consumed the majority of both sides' industrial output. Shells were manufactured by the millions. Artillery pieces were produced in quantities that would have supplied entire armies in previous wars. A single British 18-pounder field gun could fire 20 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. Sustained fire was closer to 4 rounds per minute. A typical British division in 1916 possessed 76 field guns plus heavier artillery. During a major offensive, these guns would fire continuously for days. The weight of shells fired during the Somme offensive exceeded the total weight of shells fired during the entire Boer War. This was not exceptional. Verdun consumed more. Passchendaele would consume more still. Industrial capacity became a decisive factor in the war's outcome. Germany could not match the combined production of Britain, France, and eventually the United States. Lieutenant Cyril Denys of the Royal Garrison Artillery commanded a battery of heavy howitzers. He recorded in his diary that during offensive preparations, his battery alone fired over 10,000 rounds in a week. The barrels wore out. The guns required recalibration daily. Crews worked in shifts to maintain the firing rate. Denys noted that the amount of ammunition his single battery fired would have supplied an entire brigade during the Napoleonic Wars. Shell shock appeared in medical records early in the war. By 1916, it was epidemic. The condition manifested in various ways: trembling, inability to speak, paralysis without physical injury, violent nightmares, emotional outbursts, complete psychological withdrawal. The British Army initially treated shell shock as cowardice. Men exhibiting symptoms were disciplined or executed for refusing orders. This approach proved counterproductive. Too many men developed symptoms. Too many officers developed symptoms. Medical authorities eventually recognized shell shock as a legitimate psychiatric injury caused by prolonged exposure to artillery bombardment. Captain J.C. Dunn, medical officer for the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, described treating men who could not stop trembling despite being in safe areas, men who wept uncontrollably, men who could not sleep more than an hour without waking in terror. Dunn noted that these men were not cowards. Many had exemplary combat records. The human nervous system had limits. Artillery found those limits reliably. Treatment for shell shock was primitive. Rest behind the lines, sedation, attempts at psychotherapy by doctors with no psychiatric training. Some men recovered, many did not. Thousands of shell shock cases lingered in hospitals for years after the armistice. Some never recovered. Machine guns killed fewer men than artillery, but shaped tactics more thoroughly. A single machine gun team could defend a position against hundreds of attackers if the gun remained operational. This forced attacking forces to concentrate artillery on suppressing machine gun positions before infantry advanced. The German MG-08, the British Vickers and the French Hotchkiss all operated on similar principles. Water-cooled, belt-fed, capable of sustained fire at rates exceeding 500 rounds per minute. A well-trained crew could maintain fire indefinitely provided ammunition and water remained available. Private Frank Richards of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers described the sound of machine gun fire as similar to tearing canvas, but amplified and continuous. During heavy fighting, the sound became a wall. Individual shots could not be distinguished. The bullets arrived in streams. Men caught in the stream died. Men outside the stream lived. Movement determined outcome. Passchendaele, July to November 1917. The Third Battle of Ypres, known as Passchendaele, was fought in mud. The Flanders region receives heavy rainfall. The drainage systems that kept the land usable had been destroyed by 3 years of shelling. British artillery preparation churned the ground into a morass. Rain fell throughout the offensive. The battlefield became liquid. The battle began on July 31st, 1917. British forces attacked German positions along a ridge east of Ypres. Initial gains were modest. Rain began on August 1st and continued intermittently for weeks. Shell craters filled with water. Wounded men drowned in the craters. The mud was deep enough to swallow men, horses, and equipment. Lieutenant Edwin Vaughan of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment recorded his experience during an attack in August. His company advanced across ground where the mud reached waist-deep in places. Men who stepped off duckboards or established paths sank. Some sank too far to be pulled free. Vaughan watched men drown in mud while their companions attempted rescue. The Germans shelled the rescue attempts. Vaughan's company suffered 50% casualties without reaching its objective. The ridge at Passchendaele rose only 50 meters above the surrounding terrain. It was not strategically significant. Field Marshal Douglas Haig ordered its capture because the offensive had begun and required some success to justify the casualties already incurred. British and Canadian forces attacked repeatedly through October and November. Private Robert Lindsay of the Canadian Corps described the fighting near the village of Passchendaele itself. The village no longer existed. It had been destroyed so thoroughly that locating its former boundaries required maps. The ridge was composed of mud, shell craters, and corpses. The smell was overwhelming. Lindsay noted that after several days in the sector, men stopped noticing the smell. The human capacity for adaptation was remarkable even under these conditions. Canadian forces captured what remained of Passchendaele on November 6, 1917. The offensive ended shortly after. British and Commonwealth casualties exceeded 275,000. German casualties approached 220,000. The ridge was abandoned by British forces in April 1918 during the German Spring Offensive. Every casualty incurred taking the position had been wasted. Passchendaele demonstrated the limits of attrition warfare. Both sides could absorb casualties indefinitely without producing strategic decision. The battle also demonstrated that commanders would continue offensive operations regardless of conditions, casualties, or prospects for success. Institutional momentum and political pressure overrode tactical reality. Major General Sir Archibald Montgomery wrote in his diary that Passchendaele was murder, not war. Men were being sent to die in conditions that made success impossible. Montgomery was not a junior officer writing from limited perspective. He was a senior commander who understood the strategic picture. His assessment was blunt. The offensive should have been halted. It was not. General Robert Nivelle promised breakthrough. He had achieved limited success at Verdun using concentrated artillery and carefully timed infantry assaults. He convinced French political leadership that the same methods could break the German line along the Chemin des Dames Ridge. The offensive began on April 16, 1917. French artillery preparation was extensive but less thorough than Nivelle required. German intelligence had captured French planning documents. The Germans knew when and where the attack would occur. They adjusted their defenses accordingly. French infantry advanced with expectations of rapid success. They encountered intact defensive positions, machine gun fire, and German counterattacks. Casualties were immediate and severe. By the end of the first day, French losses exceeded 40,000. Nivelle's promise of breakthrough had produced another failed offensive. The fighting continued for weeks. French casualties approached 187,000. German casualties were approximately 168,000. The French line advanced several miles in some sectors. No breakthrough occurred. Nivelle was relieved of command. Pétain replaced him. The consequences extended beyond casualty figures. French soldiers had endured Verdun based on promises that their suffering would end the war. The Nivelle offensive's failure broke that faith. Mutinies spread through French units in May and June. Entire divisions refused orders to attack. The mutinies were not revolutionary. Soldiers did not abandon positions. They simply refused to participate in further offensives. Pétain restored order through a combination of concessions and discipline. Leave was increased. Conditions were improved. Ringleaders were court-martialed. 55 soldiers were executed. Hundreds more were imprisoned. The French army remained functional but required months to recover offensive capability. Corporal Paul Dubreuil of the French 39th Infantry Regiment wrote that the mutinies reflected despair rather than disloyalty. Soldiers had concluded that their commanders did not value their lives. The methods employed were proven to fail, yet the same methods continued. Men could accept death in service of victory. They could not accept death in service of repetition. The German Spring Offensive, March to July 1918. Russia's withdrawal from the war freed German divisions for transfer to the Western Front. General Erich Ludendorff planned a massive offensive to achieve victory before American forces arrived in decisive numbers. The attack would employ new tactics. Stormtroopers would infiltrate rather than assault. Artillery would emphasize gas and smoke rather than high explosive. Speed would matter more than ground. The offensive began on March 21, 1918, along the Somme. German forces achieved surprise and local superiority. British positions were overrun. The advance penetrated up to 40 miles in some sectors. This was movement on a scale not seen since 1914. German success created problems. The stormtrooper units advanced beyond their supply lines. Follow-on forces moved slower. Artillery could not keep pace. British resistance stiffened. The German advance lost momentum. Subsequent German offensives in April and May achieved similar results: initial success, deep penetration, loss of momentum. The Germans took ground but failed to destroy Allied armies or capture strategic objectives. Each offensive exhausted German reserves. The Allies, reinforced by American units, absorbed the attacks and prepared counter-offensives. Private Ernst Toller of the German army described the March offensive as chaos. Units advancing quickly lost communication with higher command. Objectives changed hourly. Supply lines were non-existent in some sectors. Toller's unit captured British positions only to find themselves isolated and under counterattack. The experience of breakthrough warfare, so long anticipated, proved as difficult as trench warfare, but with less preparation. German casualties during the spring offensive exceeded 680,000. Allied casualties were comparable. The Germans had traded irreplaceable soldiers for expendable territory. By July, German offensive capability was exhausted. The strategic initiative passed to the Allies. The Allied counter-offensive began on August 8, 1918 at Amiens. British, French, Canadian and Australian forces attacked with tank support and air superiority. German positions collapsed. Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German army. The offensive continued across the entire Western Front. Allied forces did not attempt breakthrough. They applied pressure everywhere simultaneously. German reserves were stretched beyond capacity. Units retreated repeatedly. Some units disintegrated. Desertions increased. The Germans fell back to prepared defensive positions. The Hindenburg Line was supposed to halt the Allied advance. It was breached in September. German commanders began requesting armistice. The civilian government hesitated. The offensive continued. By November, German defensive coherence had dissolved. Units surrendered. Mutinies occurred in rear areas. The Navy refused to sail. Revolution threatened. On November 11, 1918, the armistice took effect. The guns stopped. The 100 Days offensive cost approximately 350,000 Allied casualties. German casualties exceeded 750,000. The offensive demonstrated that the Western Front could be broken using combined arms tactics, numerical superiority, and industrial resources. It also demonstrated that such breaking required years of attrition to create the necessary preconditions. Sergeant Harry Patch, who survived the war as one of the last living veterans, described the 100 Days as collapsing a structure already weakened. The German army in 1918 was not the German army of 1914. 4 years of casualties had consumed the trained soldiers. Replacements were younger, less experienced, poorly equipped. The outcome was predetermined once Germany could no longer match Allied resources. Universities sent their students to war. The students did not return. Britain lost 170,000 university students and graduates. France lost comparable numbers. Germany lost more. These were not merely casualties. They were the engineers who would have built the next generation of infrastructure, the scientists who would have advanced research, the teachers who would have educated subsequent generations, the artists who would have shaped culture. The war poets are remembered because they survived long enough to write, or because their work survived their deaths. Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Isaac Rosenberg, Robert Graves. Their talent was exceptional, but not unique. They represented a generation that possessed similar capacity. Most of that generation died before producing significant work. Second Lieutenant Wilfred Owen of the Manchester Regiment was killed on November 4th, 1918, 1 week before the armistice. He was 25 years old. His poems about the war are considered masterworks. His potential contributions beyond those poems cannot be calculated because he did not live to make them. The intellectual destruction extended beyond individuals. Research programs were abandoned. Universities operated with skeleton staff. Publishing houses closed. Laboratories were repurposed for war production. The infrastructure of intellectual life was damaged as severely as the physical infrastructure of northern France. France lost approximately 1.4 million men killed. Germany lost approximately 2 million. Britain lost nearly 900,000. These figures represent direct battlefield deaths. They do not include deaths from disease, deaths from wounds received during the war, but occurring after the armistice, or the children those men never had. The demographic impact compounded across decades. The missing generation created gaps in every profession. The survivors who were disabled by wounds or psychological damage could not fill those gaps. The widows and unmarried women outnumbered available men. Birth rates declined. Europe's population growth stalled. Dr. Henri Barbusse, French army, wrote after the war that an entire civilization had been fed into the machinery of industrial warfare. The machinery had processed the civilization efficiently. What emerged was diminished, not destroyed, but permanently altered. The confidence that had characterized European intellectual life before 1914 was gone. It never returned. Accounting for casualties on the Western Front requires distinguishing between killed, died of wounds, missing presumed dead, permanently disabled, temporarily disabled, and shell-shock cases. Official figures are unreliable. Many bodies were never recovered. Many men listed as missing were dead. Many men listed as wounded later died of complications. Conservative estimates place total Western Front casualties at approximately 8 million killed and 21 million wounded across all combatant nations. These figures span 4 years. They represent an average of 20,000 casualties per day, every day for the duration of the war. Individual battles produced casualties that exceeded some nations' entire populations. Verdun consumed approximately 800,000 casualties across both sides. The Somme exceeded 1 million. Passchendaele approached 500,000. These were individual battles, not entire campaigns. The scale becomes comprehensible only through comparison. The Western Front killed more French soldiers than all of France's wars from 1815 to 1914 combined. It killed more British soldiers than any conflict in British history before or since. It killed more German soldiers than Germany would lose in World War II's Western Front campaigns. Artillery caused approximately 60% of all casualties. Machine guns caused roughly 25%. Rifles caused less than 10%. The remaining casualties resulted from gas, disease, accidents, and other factors. Men died without seeing the enemy in the majority of cases. The wounded presented challenges that exceeded medical infrastructure. Field hospitals could handle trauma, but not volume. Gangrene killed thousands. Infection killed thousands more. Soldiers with wounds that would be survivable in modern conflicts died from lack of antibiotics, lack of blood transfusions, lack of surgical capacity. Sergeant William Harris, Royal Army Medical Corps, described working in a field hospital during the Somme. Wounded men arrived in numbers that made triage meaningless. Doctors operated continuously, moving from table to table. Men died waiting for treatment. Bodies were removed to make space for incoming wounded. The smell was indescribable. Harris worked 72 hours without sleep, then collapsed. When he woke, he returned to the operating theatre, the permanent wound. Shell shock did not end with the armistice. Thousands of men returned home psychologically destroyed. They could not work. They could not maintain relationships. They could not sleep without nightmares. They could not tolerate loud noises. They could not function in civilian society. British hospitals and asylums housed shell shock patients for decades after the war. Some never left. Some recovered partially. Few recovered completely. The Veterans Administration in the United States reported similar patterns. Shell shock patients required long-term care that the medical system was not prepared to provide. The psychological damage was not limited to diagnosed cases. Millions of veterans carried trauma without seeking treatment. They drank to suppress memories. They isolated themselves. They committed suicide at rates significantly higher than non-veteran populations. The war followed them until death. Robert Graves, who served on the Western Front and survived, wrote decades later that he never fully recovered. The nightmares diminished but never disappeared. The hypervigilance remained. The inability to trust civilians remained. Graves was fortunate. His talent allowed him a career. Most veterans lacked such options. The families of veterans suffered secondarily. Wives described husbands who were physically present but emotionally absent. Children grew up with fathers who could not show affection. The trauma propagated across generations in ways that were not understood at the time. The war in eastern Ukraine reintroduced trench warfare to Europe after a century's absence. The scale is smaller. The technology is different. The fundamental dynamics are similar. Artillery dominates. Infantry take positions and hold them under bombardment. Casualties accumulate without decisive gains. The front line stabilizes into a semi-permanent structure. Soldiers in Ukrainian trenches describe conditions comparable to World War I. Mud, cold, artillery fire that arrives without warning, the inability to move during daylight, the psychological strain of waiting for shells. The similarity is not coincidental. The geography is similar. The tactical problem is similar. The solution, such as it is, remains similar. Drones have replaced some aerial reconnaissance functions. Precision-guided munitions are more common. Communications technology is vastly superior. None of these changes have solved the fundamental problem. Attacking prepared positions defended by modern weapons remains costly. defenders can impose severe casualties on attackers without requiring numerical superiority. The Western Front demonstrated that industrial societies could sustain casualties for years without political collapse. Ukraine is demonstrating the same principle. The willingness to absorb losses, more than tactical innovation, determines outcomes in attritional warfare. The title, All Quiet on the Western Front, was ironic when Erich Maria Remarque published it in 1929. The Western Front was never quiet. Artillery fired continuously for 4 years. The sound carried for miles. Villagers behind the lines lived with constant noise. Soldiers suffered hearing damage from prolonged exposure to gunfire. After the armistice, the silence was temporary. The guns stopped. The memory did not. The physical landscape of northern France and Belgium remained destroyed for decades. Farmers ploughing fields in the 1920s unearthed corpses, unexploded shells, and personal effects. The iron harvest continues. Munitions from the Western Front still kill people who disturb them. The war ended in November 1918. The consequences did not. Germany's resentment over the Versailles Treaty created conditions for the next war. France's demographic crisis weakened it in 1940. Britain's economic exhaustion contributed to imperial decline. The United States emerged as a global power partly because it had not suffered the same devastation. The Western Front consumed the generation that would have led Europe through the 1920s and 1930s. The men who survived were often not the most capable. They were the lucky. Luck is not a qualification for leadership. The political failures of the interwar period reflected, at least partially, the absence of men who might have led more effectively. The memorials are numerous: Thiepval, Menin Gate, Vimy Ridge. Each lists names by the thousands. Each represents a fraction of the total. The majority of dead have no known grave. They were obliterated by shell fire, or buried in collapsed trenches, or lost in the mud. Their names appear on memorials to the missing because their bodies were never found. Private Henry Tandy, who survived the war as Britain's most decorated private soldier, lived until 1977. He rarely spoke about his experiences. When asked, he described the Western Front as hell, but hell without the structure. Hell had rules. The Western Front had none. Men died for no reason. Others survived for no reason. Courage, cowardice, skill, stupidity, none of it mattered. Artillery determined outcomes. Men were variables in an equation they did not control. France mobilized approximately 8.4 million men. Of these, 1.4 million were killed, 4.2 million were wounded, and 537,000 were taken prisoner or went missing. The casualty rate exceeded 70%. Germany mobilized approximately 11 million men. Of these, 2 million were killed, 4.2 million were wounded, and 1.2 million were taken prisoner or went missing. The casualty rate approached 67%. Britain and its empire mobilized approximately 8.9 million men. Of these, 900,000 were killed, 2.1 million were wounded, and 192,000 were taken prisoner or went missing. The casualty rate was approximately 36%. The United States mobilized approximately 4.7 million men, of which 2 million deployed to Europe. American combat casualties totaled 320,000, including 116,000 killed. The American experience was compressed into the final 18 months of the war. Total Allied casualties on all fronts exceeded 22 million. Total Central Powers casualties exceeded 15 million. These figures include all theatres of war, but the Western Front accounted for the majority of European casualties. The men who died at Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, and the dozens of smaller battles are still there. The bodies that were recovered lie in military cemeteries. The bodies that were not recovered lie where they fell. The ground in northern France and Belgium is saturated with human remains. French farmers work fields where the subsurface is composed of metal fragments, unexploded ordnance, and bone. Construction projects require careful excavation. The Zone Rouge, areas deemed too contaminated for human habitation, remains closed. The poison that saturated the ground in 1917 remains toxic a century later. The last combat veteran of the Western Front died in 2011. His name was Claude Schulz. He had served in the Royal Navy. He was 110 years old. With his death, the war moved from living memory to history. The physical scars remain. The Somme battlefield has been partially reforested. The shell craters are still visible. The Lochnagar crater, created by a British mine in 1916, is 300 feet wide and 90 feet deep. It will remain visible indefinitely. The Douaumont ossuary near Verdun contains the remains of 130,000 unidentified soldiers. The bones were gathered from the battlefield and placed in a common tomb because individual identification was impossible. Visitors can see the bones through windows in the building's foundation. The Western Front created the 20th century, the political boundaries, the international organizations, the weapons technology, the total war doctrine, the recognition that industrial civilization could destroy itself. Everything that followed emerged from those 4 years. Europe survived, the empires did not. Austria-Hungary dissolved, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The Russian Empire became the Soviet Union, the German Empire became the Weimar Republic. Britain and France remained, but were diminished. The colonial subjects who fought in European trenches returned home with questions about why they served empires that treated them as inferiors. The men who survived carried the war until they died. Some lived long lives. Some died young from delayed effects of gas exposure or wounds that never fully healed. All of them aged differently than men who had not fought. The experience was permanent. There is no conclusion to draw. The Western Front happened. The casualties were recorded. The ground was contested, captured, lost, recaptured, and finally abandoned. The war ended because both sides were exhausted, not because either side won decisively. The soldiers who are buried in the cemeteries at Teinkot, Thiepval, and thousands of other locations did not die for victory. They died because they were ordered to advance, and the machine guns were operational. That is the only explanation that accounts for the evidence. The Western Front was not quiet. It will never be quiet. The shells are still there.